cross-platform app development. Have you ever wondered how to build a mobile app? Well, there's numerous ways you can approach building a mobile app, whether that's native or cross-platform development. In this video, we're going to run through 3 key questions around cross-platform development. Firstly, what is the history of mobile app development? Why is cross-platform application development so much better? And what are the best tools to use in cross-platform app development? I previously touched on building a mobile app in one of our previous videos, so check that out. But in this video, we'll be concentrating on cross-platform app development. I'm Matt Grace, Managing Director of Flying Donkey. Let's get into it. What's the history of mobile app development? Mobile applications have actually been around for almost 30 years. In their very infancy, they all started with IBM, with some fairly mundane and basic applications. Probably one of the first big breakthroughs in mobile applications was the release of the BlackBerry. The BlackBerry was released in 1999. One of its key features was its QWERTY full-size keyboard. The BlackBerry was targeted at emails and productivity, and because of that, it's had some of the first mobile applications in the form of email apps. Fast forward to the late 2000s, around 2007 and 2008, and Apple released the iPhone in 2007. At this point, they released the first Apple App Store, and then later next year, in 2008, Android was released with its App Store, now called Google Play Store. The Apple App Store and the Google Play Store are the main 2 app stores to get mobile apps onto mobile operating systems, as iOS and Android are the 2 dominant players in that field. Now, while that sounds quite good, they both pose different challenges. Developing for 2 different platforms means potentially 2 code bases and 2 styles of apps. Can cross-platform application development solve this problem? Before we get into that, let's have a look at what types of cross-platform application development are there. There's really 2 key ways you can do this with cross-platform application development. The first one is using what's called a PWA, or a progressive web app, and the second one is using a cross-compiled application, or simply put, an application that is pre-compiled in one language and then will be compiled into 1 or more languages after that. We'll discuss more of that later in the video. Now, it's key to keep in mind that the standard operations of building any application is roughly the same. You're still going to need backend, you're still going to need UI design, you're still going to need to do programming. Here we're really concentrating on the core functionality of the mobile app and how that can easily get onto the Apple and Google ecosystems of iOS and Android. Alright, let's take a quick look at progressive web apps. Now, progressive web apps are essentially a web application that you can save as an icon on your smartphone. These aren't technically released through any of the app stores. These act very similar to how normal or native apps will react on your phone. A progressive web app is simply a website that you go to and save down to your homepage, and then launch as if it's any other app. The difference here obviously is it's not actually running as a local native application on your phone, and therefore there will be limitations on what you can and can't interact with on the phone itself. Google's a dominant player pushing progressive web apps, and there's plenty of documentation on the web around progressive web apps. But I'd always suggest you have a look at that as a first point of call, because generating a progressive web app essentially means that you're only going to have to build one web application, and it can become a mobile app. Alright, you've decided you need to go down the route of actually releasing a mobile application. It's either got to be native to either of the platforms or released through an app store. One of the ways you can do this is through cross-compiled applications. To use an example here, let's look at a framework that we use here at Flying Donkey, which is Google's Flutter. Now, in Google's Flutter, it uses a language called Dart, which is very similar to JavaScript. And what you do is you develop your application in the Google Flutter Dart language, and then once you're completed, you can then compile this application to either Apple's iOS or Android's Play Store. So what you have here is one single code base that then gets compiled to 2 different functioning applications. We'll touch on this a bit more later, but I'm sure you can see some of the savings this potentially can have rather than having 2 sets of native code and coding for 2 separate platforms. Alright, UI, UX for mobile apps and workflows. I just want to quickly touch on this because it's important to keep in mind. While Apple and Android look very similar on the surface, they have very different design principles underneath. Apple uses the Human Interface Guidelines, while Google uses its Material Design. It's also important to know there are far more Android devices out there than there are with iOS ones. And this is because obviously Android is a standalone operating system that any phone manufacturer can use, whereas iOS is locked down to only Apple hardware. And this means generating an application for an iOS application is far simpler. You have less phones to support, less resolutions, and less functionality. Whereas with Android, you have a much wider market of handsets that potentially the application can be used on. Alright, you know you need to build an application and you want to work out which store is the best to launch it on. Do you launch it on Apple's iOS, or do you launch it on Google's Play Store? Now, this is a hard one to choose because it's going to be different for each situation, but I'll give you a few guiding principles that you can use. Firstly, where is your target audience? Is your target audience primarily on Apple's iOS, or are they on Google's Android? Sometimes, depending on the application, if it's an internal use company application and you have company issue Apple phones, you can possibly get away with only developing for Apple's iOS. When you're going out to public and you're not sure, you're going to have to really cater for both scenarios. Secondly, what type of app are you going to build? Is it a simple productivity app or is it a gaming app? And do either of the platforms support your functionality better or worse? Thirdly, internally in your programming division, do you support a programming language better than another? Obviously, iOS develops in the Swift language, whereas Android is developed in Java. So potentially, internally, you've got a skill set that's already aligned to one of those stores, and therefore that will be the recommended decision to go with. But keep in mind, if your target audience isn't aligned with your skill set, you may need to get some help or some extra contractors in to help you deliver the application. And finally, budget. We all know that Apple is an expensive product, and therefore its users generally have more disposable income. But generally speaking, we see there's more revenue generated on apps through the Apple App Store than there is through the Google Android Store. But again, this is really going to come down to your target market and where they live, and what the rationale for the app is. A simple game site that you want everyone to download is very different to an internal company app that you're trying to develop. At the end of the day, selecting which platform to go with is a challenging decision, and there's conflicting reasons why you'll go with one or the other. But this doesn't have to be the case. You can go with cross-platform app development, and let's take a look at what that can do for you. As I mentioned, developing on one of these two platforms means you're going to have to code in their native language. But with Apple being on Swift and Android being on Java, it means that your code base is going to be split by language and by skill set. By building a cross-platform app, it means you'll have a single code base with a single language. And therefore, you can concentrate on both apps equally in a single code base and spend far less time developing your application. We've run some numbers internally on cross-platform app development, and we find that between 40 and 50% can be saved by using a cross-platform app development tool when trying to develop for both Android and iOS. This is simply down to only having to build one application rather than two. So you're not quite getting a 50% saving, but near or nearabouts because there is some crossover into the stores. A few key things to keep in mind here, as I mentioned earlier, there's still going to be a UX UI component that you're going to have to do across both applications, as well as building the back-end APIs for the application. This is irrelevant of whether you go with Android or iOS or you go cross-platform app development. At the same time, the cross-platform apps are really good these days, and we use Google Flutter here, and we've seen that it can almost do everything a native app can do, but there are a few things that it can't do. So if you're really going to push the boundaries and need the native features of the phone, you might have to bite the bullet and go with a native app. It's worth listing these features up front and checking this with the platform you choose and making sure that it can either be supported natively or if you can do it in a cross-platform application. So finally, what is the best cross-platform application framework? Well, we're slightly biased here at Flying Donkey, but we have tested a number of them over the time. We've ended up choosing Google Flutter for its flexibility, speed, and constant updating from Google. We have used some other frameworks such as Xamarin, and we found a number of challenges with building applications using that. It is getting improved and Microsoft is moving it forward, but overall we found the Google Flutter experience much better, and we've been able to deliver great applications for our clients. The time frames we've had in delivering both Google and Apple apps from a single code base has really been happy for our clients, and we highly recommend building cross-platform apps for your apps going forward. Realistically, unless you're only concentrating on one platform, iOS, and you never think you're ever going to build an Android app at all, it really makes no sense not to go down the cross-platform app development route. If you're thinking about building a cross-platform app, if you need some insights on Flutter or other platforms you'd like to use, feel free to reach out and we'd be happy to have a chat.